name's Gordy. I am the, I guess, Master of Ceremonies tonight, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce both of our speakers and give just a little bit of facilitation to the night, other than the facilitation provided by our topic for tonight, which is beer, and specifically Oktoberfest beer. So the Chemists Club is always interested in the chemistry and chemical engineering as it's applied to large problems such as brewing, within oil refining, and even into pharmaceuticals. So tonight we have two absolute stars. We have George Dimopoulos. He has about 30 years worth of experience in the brewing industry. He's worked for Anheuser-Busch for about 20 years in quality assurance. So he knows how good beer should taste. And then whenever they acquired AB InBev, he worked for 10 years for AB InBev and is now up in Boston working for the Sam Adams again in, I believe, quality insurance. Phil Leinhart is our resident brewmaster. He works up at Ommegang. So Ommegang is a fantastic brewery based up in Cooperstown. It's a Belgian style New York brewery. They've got some fantastic beers. I really like my wit beers. Ommegang Wit is a great beer produced by them. So he has the technical insight and know-how on how to make a really good beer. So I think between the three of us, we've got someone who likes to drink beer, someone who can make good beer, and someone who knows how beer should taste. So both Phil and George should be able to provide some really great insights, and I'll fumble around and provide the banter. So George has some introductions about for tonight, whether it's about Oktoberfest or just beer in general, and I'm going to hand the floor across to him.
Thank you. You stole everything I had to say, though. Thank you. Yeah, my name is George Dimopoulos, and I'm currently with the Boston Beer Company, otherwise known as Sam Adams. I'm the quality manager presently at the Pennsylvania Brewery. And I want to thank Dr. Stefando and the Chemist Club for allowing us to talk a little bit about beer, which is certainly a topic that I love, and hopefully I think we'll have a fun evening. Tonight's topic will be on, first of all, let me say also to all of you that are out there, I hope you stay safe in this COVID environment that we're living in. Thank you for the invitation again to everybody. Tonight we have a guest speaker who I personally am very fond of his brewing knowledge. I really admire him. He started, as a brewer essentially, has worked through various microbreweries and worked at the time also for the world's largest brewer. So he has experience throughout the whole industry. He's been assistant brewmaster. He's had roles in quality and maintenance, but primarily, throughout the brewing ranks. His last position was with Ommegang and being the brewmaster there. Besides, being a technical expert, he also is a great guy, and he's a friend of mine. And basically, I'm going to hand it over to him. Phil, you're on, Mr. Phil Leinhart.
All right, thanks, George. It's very kind words of you, and I feel the same, George. Very fond of your talent and knowledge, and you're a good friend. So thank you for inviting me to this. I guess we're talking about Oktoberfest beer, right? Secrets revealed. So I just want to say, George was my first trainer at Anheuser-Busch in 1995. I started at AB in Newark, and I started in the fermentation department, and George was my first trainer. On midnight shift, I think. That was a shock to me, but took me a little while to get used to that, but it was a good experience. As he said, I left AB in 2007 and came up to Ommegang and as brewmaster there. Unfortunately, I was just let go in August due to COVID, essentially, a restructure there. So if anybody from Sam Adams is here I'm available. I'm looking for something else right now. I'm not sure what that's going to lead to, but I have a couple things cooking. But I've been fervently researching some of the history of Oktoberfest a little bit and the beers. I've been to Oktoberfest. I've been there a couple times. I studied for a time at the Dermans Institute just south of Munich, and I worked I did like apprenticeship in Paulaner back then. Well, now they're merged, like Paulaner and Hackabschor are the same brewery in downtown Munich. But a little bit about the history. The first Oktoberfest, I don't even know if it was called the Oktoberfest then, was in 1810, October 12th. And it celebrated the marriage between the Crown Prince Ludwig of Bavaria, was married to Princess Therese of Saxony Hildburghausen. So it was like a wedding reception, big party. They had like a horse race and some other festivities. Beer didn't really come on the scene until, like, the best I could gather, I got a couple sources here and there's some conflicts, but around 1818, because it developed, I guess, after the first celebration. People just had a great time, as Bavarians know how to do. And they said, let's keep doing this. So it turned into like a yearly celebration. And then it became like very tied to agriculture. So they had like an agriculture show. It reminds me of like maybe like a 4-H, like an old 4-H kind of fair. But beer being, liquid bread in Germany, Germans think of beer as part of their staple diet, at least historically. I think that's changing a little bit. But so that's a little bit about just the history. Now it's just a crazy festival. Last time I was there was I don't know, like in the early 2000s, and it was just nuts. They say like up to 6 million people go now per year, and they have all carnival rides. I don't know if anybody's been there, but it's something to experience. It really is a lot of fun, and everybody's drinking beer out of the big liter Masses. My brothers came over when I was there, and my oldest brother said, I've never had a beer, drinking a beer, and I can see the beer coming at me, because like they have the big liter mugs, and it like it covers your whole face, so you can see like into the glass, and like you can see the wave of fest beer coming at you. But to the best what I could find, probably the original Oktoberfest beers were more akin to what we would think of a Dunkles today, darker, possibly smoky. A lot of it was hinged on the malting technology. Back then, all malt was before they really had indirect heating, so all malt was kilned over like direct fires and so forth. So not a lot of control, probably. The malts probably varied a lot in terms of the color and so forth. Probably fairly dark and probably somewhat smoky, just because of the that direct heat flame and the flue of the combustion going right into the malt. So the best I could find is like probably the original Oktoberfests were relatively dark. They probably called them Märzens then. März is March in German, and that's, back then there was a law in Germany. There may have been in other countries too, because it's quite common. Most of the brewing back in those days before refrigeration was done from the fall through the spring, because they didn't have refrigeration, especially with lager brewing, cooler fermentation, slower, cooler fermentations, lagering temperatures. They were prohibited. There was a law in Germany. They were prohibited to brew between April and I believe it was sometime in September. It was like some saints' days and so forth. So yeah, a lot of those original brews, they probably called them even Märzens then, because the brewers, they usually, like in March or April, they knew they were brewing a beer that needed to last through the summer, or into the summer. So typically they would brew like a little bit stronger alcohol and so forth, maybe a little bit higher hop content. They had started to find out that higher hop contents and alcohol helped with the stability of the beers, the microbiological stability. And then it seems like somewhere around the mid 1800s, they started to develop this indirect heating of the malts. So I think they gained better control of the kilning process. They're constantly evolving the whole process, germination and steeping into kilning. But indirect heating came into malting process. So higher control, they started using things like thermometers, and, it's the whole scientific revolution, industrial revolution. They just started to get more control over the process. And then from what I can see, like Gabriel Schädelmeier, it was like a brewmaster of Spaten, and his friend Anton Dreher in Vienna, and they started experimenting with these not so dark and not so smoky malts, and they developed these like the what we think of today as the Märzen style. And Schädelmeier in Spaten in Munich developed his own. From what I can read, his examples were a little more malty, maybe not so hop driven, whereas Anton Dreher in Vienna, those beers were a little bit drier, finished drier. And so like the malts that evolved to what we have today are like a Vienna malt, like a high kiln malt. They're not caramel malts. You see sometimes people think Oktoberfest is made with caramel. It's not made with a crystal or a caramel malt because they're sweeter. The Märzens, those Oktoberfest from those days were made with predominantly, in addition to base Pilsner malt, was a Vienna style malt, which gave those beers a real nice reddish tinge color, and maybe a lower kiln Munich malt to give that nice toasty, biscuity flavor, but not too sweet. The beers are not cloyingly sweet. They finish relatively dry, well attenuated. And then, so that was what we think of as like the traditional Oktoberfest beers are Märzens. And a lot of those Munich breweries still make those beers, but from what I have read, they don't make them, they only bottle them for export. So you probably can get, Paulaner, and I don't know if it still says on the label, it used to say Märzen, like original Märzen. And so, yeah, those, that's how they evolved in that style. And then, so Märzen was like the official beer of Oktoberfest until around what I'm reading is 1970. And that's when Paulaner apparently came out. They decided the Märzens were too sweet, they were too strong, they were too filling. They introduced this lighter beer that they call fest beer, or sometimes they refer to it as the Weizen, like, so the Oktoberfest is in the Theresian Weisses. So the Princess Therese, who got married at the original Oktoberfest, that whole meadow is named for her, and that's what they call the beer now, the fest beer, the Weizen. And that beer, it's not as so I have here's a Sierra Nevada fest beer, and this is typical of what they serve at Oktoberfest now. A fest beer, it's not, so that's, if you can see, that's the fest beer, and here's like a Brooklyn Oktoberfest. That's more the color of a Märzen. It's got a reddish, darker reddish brown color, whereas the Weizen is more of a golden copper color. And this is what they serve at Oktoberfest now. A little bit, not so heavy, not as sweet as the Märzens, not as filling. So you can eat, 10 pretzels and all kind of bratwurst and stuff like that. And a little bit not as strong as the Märzens. So it's interesting, Munich as a brewing center, like historically, the famous brewing centers like Munich, Dublin for Guinness, Burton-on-Trent for like Bass Pale Ale, Pilsen, for the original Pilsners. A lot of them developed those styles because of the water quality, the water chemistry they had. So Munich's water is relatively alkaline, high in bicarbonates. And so they discovered that these even when they could make paler malts, that until they really discovered a lot about water adjustment and so forth, that these darker beers just tasted better. And one of the main reasons is because like some of the products of the caramelization and the melanoidins and things like that, these are acidic compounds that naturally balance the alkalinity of the water. So you hit a good target pH in your mash. pH in a mash is important for the enzymes because the amylase enzymes have the optima roughly in that range of 5.1 to 5.6 pH. But also the beer is better if you make a beer in a certain style, in a style like that, and the pH is out of whack, the beer can become kind of one-dimensional. It lacks amplitude, and it can just become one-dimensional and harsh. So not only important for the enzymes and how the activity of the enzymes, but the flavor of the final beer. So that's, that Munich, first and foremost, traditionally and historically is known for its Dunkles beers, the dark beers, because that's now they, with technology, what you can do now, reverse osmosis and so forth, and all adjusting with minerals, you can make any kind of water you want anywhere, essentially. So that tie to a historical water supply isn't as great as it was then, but that's the reason a lot of these brewing centers developed the styles they did. So that's pretty much my presentation on Oktoberfest beers. I hope there's a lot of questions. It could be about these beers or other beers in general or whatever.
Phil, I have so many questions now that you've kind of dug in and kind of uncovered a couple of the key components of the Oktoberfest beers. So, to the best of my knowledge, there's 4 things that go in a beer. You need the water, you need the malt, you need hops, and you need the yeast.
Yeah.
How you've touched on each of them a little bit. Do you mind just expanding on how the differences in the water? So Guinness, where I'm from, all they talk about, it's all about the water, and you think of Guinness, this ruby red stout. How is that sort of that variance? How is that important? Then how is the malting important? And then specifically for Oktoberfest beers in the US, where a lot of the microbrews do Oktoberfest beers, what's the key factor for them compared to sort of the more traditional?
A lot of it is using good ingredients. And if you want to make like a beer that tastes just like an Oktoberfest beer that tastes just like a fest beer in Germany, like it goes a long way to use the same malts that they're using, say, use barley that's grown in Germany, that's malted in Germany. But you can use, because different barley varieties grown different areas, malted different ways, can have flavor differences. So as like when I first came to Omegang, just an example, like a couple of the beers there, we use these specific high kiln malts from Belgium, made by Dingemans up in Antwerp. And I guess back then the supply chain was such like they would run out of those malts sometimes, and so they would substitute a different either American malt or Canadian malt. And not to say that wasn't bad, but I was like, these malts don't taste anything like these malts, and it's just if we're going to make this beer not only number one as genuine tasting as possible, but consistent, like we've got to use the same raw ingredients, we've got to use the same malts and so forth. So if you want to make something totally genuine, it goes a long way if you use the same malts that these German breweries are using. And then as far as the water goes, like I say, historically now you can make any kind of water you want, because you can put the water through reverse osmosis, basically make distilled water, and then target how much gypsum you want to put in for calcium and sulfate, how much calcium chloride and so forth. But back then, before they had those technologies, the brewers were really tied to their water supply, and they kind of discovered empirically, like Dublin with Guinness Stout, as and Munich with their Dunkles, both of those waters are fairly high in bicarbonates, so they're relatively alkaline waters, and they found that with these dark malts, like in Guinness, like the roast barley, and then in Munich with the dark malts they made there before indirect heating, I don't know if they knew it then, but they discovered later is those malts are fairly acidic. Like if you take a pure like dark malt and mash it in distilled water, and then you take a base malt, a Pilsner or a pale malt, and mash it in distilled water, the mash of that dark malt, the pH is going to be lower because it's those melanoidins and those, the compounds resulting from the kilning process are relatively acidic, so they will drop that pH. And so they found just empirically that because of these alkaline waters, like this beer tastes really good, and like I say, I'm not sure if they knew it then, but they discovered, well, the acids from the malt are balancing the alkalinity of the water to get your mash pH right in spec and so forth.
Maybe George can chime in here, but
Hey, Phil, I got a quick question. George can help on this one. It's Roland. On the same topic, if we took an Oktoberfest beer, let's say from George's brewery, using ingredients he has, and we took an Oktoberfest beer from Munich, and we took one that was more of an original Märzen beer.
Original what beer?
The Märzen, the Märzen. So if we took the three of those, okay, what would we expect the differences in flavor and taste to be, being an American, being a new Munich October, a modern new Munich, versus an original Märzen beer? What would be the difference in taste, flavor, texture, and why? I'll give you the.
I think the Sam Adams Oktoberfest is closer to a Märzen than it is to a Fest beer. So Sierra Nevada, this year, the past couple of years, they actually partnered with a German brewery. I think last year was Bitburger maybe. And I don't think they did it this year, probably because of COVID. But this is like if you went to Oktoberfest now, this is pretty close to what you'd get. It's not as dark and orange colored as the Märzen. It's not as, the Märzen has a little more caramel notes, toffee-like, but it's not sweet, not cloying. So probably like the Sam Adams Oktoberfest and the Märzen fairly close, but like I say, when a beer is made with all German versus, I don't know what Sam Adams Oktoberfest uses, but it's going to taste different. They're different barley varieties grown in different areas and malted in different malt houses. So like a lot of the German malts to me have a unique flavor to them, and it's just different. But I would say Sam Adams Oktoberfest would be closer to a Märzen, original Märzen. Like if you tasted Sam Adams Oktoberfest against a Paulaner Märzen, like in the bottle, probably pretty close. Whereas a Fest beer is definitely, like I say, this really came along in the 70s in Oktoberfest when Paulaner, they decided that the Märzens were just too rich, too heavy, too filling. And let's make, you got to realize they're drinking this by the liter, and they just thought, I'm sure, they were looking at it economically too. It's like we could probably sell a lot more of this beer because it's not so filling, not as strong, and so forth. So bottom line, I'd say Sam Adams Oktoberfest and Märzen is probably fairly close in terms of color, alcohol, bitterness, and flavor, whereas the Weizen, that the Sierra Nevada, that's what you get Oktoberfest now. So before 1970s, it would have been a Märzen at Oktoberfest, but that after the other breweries in Munich saw the popularity of the Paulaner Fest beer, the Weizen, all the other breweries started to make a similar style of beer. So there's only, five Munich breweries are allowed to serve beer in Oktoberfest. You got, if I can remember, Paulaner, Hockenschor, Augustiner, Spaten, and Hofbräuhaus. So that's, no other breweries can actually pour beer in Oktoberfest.
Jay Thompson has a question. I'm going to mute. Jay's got a question.
Can I say something on before on that particular subject before the next question? George.
Go for it, George.
Okay. I just want to say, first of all, there's no doubt as to which one is the best.
Ooh.
That being said,
I've always liked the Sam Adams Oktoberfest.
I wanted to add to what Phil said that I am having, three from Munich and ours, and I'm tasting them across the board. And they are similar in color. There are some differences, but they're fairly similar in color, fairly similar in taste. There are some differences between the four brands, ours and the other three. And Sam Adams does use ingredients from Germany. Hops are from Germany for Oktoberfest. And so is some of the malt that we use. So we try to make it, to the style.
Yeah.
What it should be.
Yeah, no, like I said, I had some Sam Adams Oktoberfest about a month ago, but I went to get some today, and now they seem to have rotated out of that as far as your seasonals. They now have the holiday beer and the Dunkles, the spices, right? The dark beer, the Bock. It's Bock beer with the spices. So yeah.
So by the looks of it, Jay Thompson has most of the original Oktoberfest beers in front of him. Would you like to make any comments on color, taste, quality? Give your own perspective, Jay. You're on mute at the minute, or we can't hear you at the minute.
Has Jay drank them all?
I think yeah. He's drank them all. Words aren't coming out.
It's this Zoom stuff that I've zoomed a Zoom. No, I've got three of them here. I had a question though for Phil. Since you started working for George, did he put you on the tasting line at any point in time and make you be a taster?
Well, I didn't really go to. It was like later in my career at AB, I used to go up to the taste room. Not so much because my first 10 years at AB, I was working shift work. So.
Well, you were just trying to stay awake. I understand.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, George and I used to go taste, and even if we were on off shift sometimes, we'd taste up in the lab. Because I'm sure it's the same way, we couldn't release a tank of beer until it was, of course, all the specs were in spec in the lab, but yeah, it had to be tasted and then initial by a supervisor.
Yeah.
So taste is huge, yeah.
All right.
It's a big part of brewing. That's what everybody asks you if they can be a taster,
So I did have
I'm sure, yeah.
Yep. And that is out of Munich, and it is a Marzen style.
Yeah.
So it was a little bit.
I didn't know that, but one of these things I read, the Munich breweries only make Märzen for export now.
Well, I am in America.
Yeah, they just bottle it, and it's not even sold in Germany. It's all exported.
That's a shame. It's a shame. It's a
yeah. I mean, it's hard to believe that they don't make some for the local German market, but I don't know.
And then the Polaner, was definitely a drink all day kind of thing.
Yeah,
it's only been 50 minutes.
I'm just curious how fresh they are. Do they have like a packaging date or a Best By date?
Yes, June of 21.
Okay.
So you think this was packaged last decade?
Pretty recently, I went. I don't know how much they're giving. That's a Best By date, so I don't know how much they're giving. I don't think they give much more than 8 months, maybe.
It does not say.
Yeah. No, if they have a Best By, they won't have a packaging date on there.
No.
Like a born on date, but.
And it is 6%.
So roughly the same. Do you have any more in one of your glasses, just so we can see what the color is?
Well, that's good. Well, I only have one glass.
Or they're done.
I regret I only have but one glass to give to the Chemist Club today.
Okay.
And it is on George's beer now. So I knew George was coming, and I George.
That's Boston Lager. Yeah.
Thank you, Jay.
And I would put that kind of in between the two,
Yeah.
closer to the Marzen than to the Fest beer.
But is that the Oktoberfest Sam Adams or the Boston Lager? They're different beers.
It is Boston Lager. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's not Oktoberfest.
I grabbed the wrong one then. It's back to the fridge.
So I don't know if another festival I've been in Germany for, which is a real humdinger if you ever get a chance to go over there, is the Starkbierzeit. So that when all the breweries make their Doppelbocks for like the pre-Lent, and so yeah, I've been to the Paulaner beer hall, and like they're serving liters of 8% ABV Doppelbock.
Oh my gosh.
It's crazy. I thought Oktoberfest was crazy, and then I went to Starkbierzeit, and I was like, oh my God. But it's so smooth, it just like...
Now so is German beer an influence for you? And have you
definitely.
just avoided the whole IPA?
No, I mean, I early before I worked at AB, I worked... my first job was in New York City. It was in Manhattan, the Manhattan Brewing Company. I don't know if you have any that was back in the early 80s. And that was my boss was an English guy. He was a brewer for Whitbreads in England and Samuel Smith's. So my first real brewing, I cut my teeth on kind of like top fermented ales, things like that. And then going over to Germany, I really got into lagers, obviously working at Anheuser-Busch, and so forth. So, and now, I always liked Belgian beers, but I didn't have a lot of experience with them. But obviously being with Ommegang and, is owned by Duvel Marquette, so I go over to Belgium once a year and spend time over there and really got into those styles. But I love German beers. I love lager beers.
Can hear it.
Love all kinds
hear
of
it in your voice.
What's that?
I can hear it in your voice.
I have two very general-ish, I want to say noobish, but questions. But you mentioned bottom fermenting yeasts and then top fermenting yeasts. What kind of is the difference in, well, one, alcohol content, but then flavor profiles just generally, because you've brought up bocks, which are bottom, and you brought up sort of pilsners and lagers, which tend to be top fermenting.
Ales. Well, generally lagers bottom fermented, ales are top fermented. Yeah.
Hey, Phil, it's Roland. As you go into this, just explain the differences in that fermentation process to a chemist, and what do you mean by fermentation?
Yeah, well,
what do you mean by those two differences?
Generally, bottom fermented lagers, top fermented ales. It's a lot of it. Just the behavior, a lot of the English breweries I was in, they're open fermenters, and the yeasts, a lot of very flocculent yeast strains. As they flock, they rise to the top, and so you skim off the top. Whereas, lagers historically harvested off the bottom of a tank. But very generally, ales, top fermented warmer, somewhat warmer temperatures than lagers. Lagers are cooler, slower fermentation. Ales generally a warmer, faster fermentation. Like at Ommegang, a lot of our beers were fermenting at 26 degrees centigrade, so very quick, fast fermentations. And because of that, and also the yeast strains, like typically at a warmer temperature, you're going to get more production of things like esters and higher alcohols and aldehydes. So you have more, besides the ethanol and the CO2 that the fermentation is producing, you have higher concentrations of these other flavor active compounds. Whereas in a cooler, slower fermentation, you don't have as much production of things like these volatile aromatic compounds like esters and aldehydes and alcohols. So that's a real, so I find like in lagers, I'm tasting generally, it's a cleaner, in a sense, a cleaner fermentation, because you're not getting this high production of all these other cogeners, all these other compounds. So some people like ales better that way because they smell fruitier to them or whatever, and that's a purely subjective thing. But that's like a real main difference. And like pretty much worldwide, even in Europe in the old days, all beers were top fermented until they, these monks and so forth down in Bavaria and Czechoslovakia, they kind of harvested this bottom fermenting strain that thrived in cooler temperatures and so forth. And that's how these, it's not like someone discovers a yeast. It's just kind of over a process of selection over time. These yeast strains get selected by brewers because they perform well in fermentation. They flocculate when you want them to do, when you want them to flocculate, and they produce good beer. So that's how the yeast strains have kind of, what we currently have today, have evolved over time in a lot of ways, because brewers are, like, in a sense, yeast harvesters. And over time, historically, they've harvested the best performing and the best tasting yeast strains.
So in terms of yeast for Oktoberfest beers specifically, does it matter whether it's top or bottom?
Oktoberfest ales. Yeah, you can. I guess you could brew an ale, but I mean, if you want to make a true fest Oktober, it's got to be a lager. It has to be bottom fermented, cool fermentation. Because, like, these beers are like I say, to me, lagers, you taste more the ingredients. You're tasting the hops and the malt. Whereas a lot of ales, especially some IPAs, of course, you're tasting a lot of hops and all that. But it's like you're just getting, those fermentations are warmer, and because they're warmer, the yeast is throwing off all these other higher concentrations of, like, flavor and aroma active compounds, such as esters, aldehydes, higher alcohols, things like that. So, like a lager, cooler fermentation, you don't get these production, or a lot of production, of all these other compounds. It's in a sense, in a sense, it's a cleaner fermentation. That make sense?
Made sense to me, and I've just finished 2 Erdinger, so makes sense then.
Well, that's a Weiss beer. That's kind of an anomaly in Germany. Yeah. That's Weiss beer, and that's an ale. Those are ales.
But kind
and
of
they use very specific yeast strains that are what they call phenolic off flavor positive. They produce, like, 4-vinyl guaiacol, which is like a very clovey aroma, and a very specific yeast strains they use in those beers.
See, for me, an Erdinger tastes more like a loaf of bread than a Marzen. I'm not a big fan, just personally, not a big fan of Marzens. Just the caramelly tones to it are way too much for me. But what you were saying was, like, they couldn't brew in the summer months. Erdinger's bottle brewed, so
conditioned, yeah.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense that they would just chuck the yeast in there and then leave it, bottle it or cap it, leave it over the summer months and crack it when they need to. But
yeah, well, they're unique in Germany, and not most beers aren't bottle conditioned in Germany, so they're kind of a unique product over there.
Cool. So I guess if you want to open up questions to the floor, just kind of drop me a note, or me or Noel a note in the chat. We can open up questions to Phil, to George, about brewing process, about Oktoberfest beers, anything that may have crossed your mind along the way. And yeah, kind of to kick off, I'll ask a question to kind of break the tension and keep things flowing. But in terms of hallmarks of an Oktoberfest beer, there are 6 big breweries in Munich. What do all of those breweries have that have become the hallmarks of a modern 2020, I guess, COVID-infected Oktoberfest beer?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What's
so, like, what are the characteristics? You've talked about it at length, but
well, like that, I mean, like, those beer, the original, the Märzens used a lot of Vienna malt, Munich malt, high dry, kilned, very biscuity, toasty. You don't want, see, that's the thing. Sometimes brewers who not that familiar with the style, they put like a lot of caramel malt in there. You don't want like caramel sweetness. These beers are relatively well attenuated and dry. They just have some of these Vienna malts, what they call high kiln malts. So they're kilned at elevated temperatures to produce a more like biscuity, toasty notes, not caramelized so much, not caramelization. So that's just a real hallmark of those beers, like a little bit darker color, a little bit nice toasty, biscuity aromas, bready, doughy aromas and flavor, and very drinkable. So that's, and all those from those different breweries. I mean, if you could probably pick out differences between them, but they all make very similar, in that style will make very similar beers.
I guess in terms of quality assurance, the analytics that you run sort of on your beers, does it go down to the minutia of LCMS, GC traces, HPLC looking for particular quantities of particular?
Yeah, well, lab is important, especially like when George and I worked at AB, and the lab had a gas chromatograph, and we used that a lot for like monitoring like indicators of when the beer is finished. So you're measuring diacetyl, you're measuring the precursors of diacetyl, acetoin, of what is converted to acetaldehyde, things like that. But still the most sensitive instrument is the human palate. No instrument can really take in all those different parameters. But like when I was in Omegang in the last year or so, we started making a Pilsner, a Belgian style Pilsner. And we had a decent lab for a small brewery, but we don't have a gas chromatograph. But I was partnering with FX Mat up in Utica. So we would run a quick sniff test. I have a pretty low threshold for diacetyl. We'd run a quick sniff test. If I was to pick it up, then we'd send a sample up to FX Mats. They'd run it on the GC. If they got diacetyl below threshold, then I know I could cool a beer and go into lager mode. So, brewing it's very interdisciplinary. You have engineering, you have chemistry, biochemistry, microbiology. There's a lot of different things, but brewing beer is not rocket science per se. It's beer. And you want to make things as consistent as possible. You want to keep your process as consistent as possible, but you have ranges. In a brewery like where George and I worked, we made millions of barrels of beer, of Budweiser and so forth. So a lot of consistency on that way is you're blending a lot. We blend malt coming in from malt houses, be blending silos in the brewery, silos of malt, be blending tanks of beer. So that's one way a lot of these breweries get consistency. But also like when I first came to Omegang, I was asking how much, when they aerate the wort, I was like, how much are you aerating the wort? And they're like, oh, we opened the valve to about there. And I'm like, no, we need to measure that. We need to put a little rotometer on there so we can measure cubic feet per minute of oxygen going into the wort. And obviously brewing is it's a rigorous thing, but you're biologically dealing with barley malt, hops, yeast. So it's all there's gonna be some variability in there. And that's where blending can come in a lot.
So I'm really glad you've brought up the idea of consistency. We have two questions. The first is from Delphine Trost. Noel, do you want to unmute her so she can ask it? And then the second question is off the back of that, so I'll let Al on after.
Hi, yeah, I'm Delphine. So I wanted to ask, I heard that one of the hardest parts about brewing is getting a consistent quality from batch to batch, even if you have the same exact ingredients and amount of like grains that you're putting in. what factors impact this the most? Would you say it's like the amount of time you're fermenting, or like your mash temperature? What's like the driving cause?
It depends on what the variability is, but that it's all important. Obviously, if your mash temperatures are not consistent, it's going to affect the fermentability of the wort, the real degree of fermentation. Like the example I gave from Omegang, like they obviously weren't aerating wort consistently because they had no measure. The key is to measure your inputs, and then you get where you want to be, and then you keep that consistent. Like at AB, we measured all kinds of things, that went into the process very closely. So it's not just the consistency of the raw ingredients, but your process, critical control points in the process, and controlling them very closely. But that being said, as the raw ingredients change, you have to adapt to that too, because the new crop of barley malt may not have the same enzymic level as last year's. So you may have to adjust your mash temperatures and things like that. So it's like it's a very dynamic thing. It's not always very static, because you're dealing with agricultural products, you're dealing with yeast and so forth like that. But is you try to keep things as consistent as possible, and then at the end of the day, which, that's a thing, like even at Omegang, we didn't have like multiple tanks of the same brand of beer lying around. So our blending opportunity was limited. A lot of bigger breweries, they can blend, if they have a brewery that's only making a few brands, they will typically have multiple tanks of certain brand that they can blend. But they're also blending a lot, a company like AB had a lot of control of incoming malt and barley and so forth. And so you're blending barley coming out of the field, going to the malt house, and you're blending the malt coming out of the malt house. And it's all geared to try and keep things consistent, And so one of the interesting things when I didn't realize, even though I had a brother who worked for AB, that, I don't know if it still is the case, but Budweiser was brewed with like something like 10 different hop varieties. And I think what I learned is one of the reasons for that is because if you get seasonal yearly fluctuations in this variety or that variety across the board, if you're only using one variety of hop or two varieties and you get these seasonal changes, that's going to be really evident in the beer. But if you're spreading that across several different varieties, it kind of evens out those variabilities.
May I add something, which I think is important? Other than, Phil touched on it in many ways. He talked about it. He said process many times. So other than ingredients, process is very important. And if you have variability in your process, you're going to have a different tasting beer. And there's many different types of variability. I just want to tell you about one, just so you start to think about what is this process thing that we're talking about. If you have two exact fermenters of beer and you ferment one 2 degrees higher than the other, because your temperature probe is off by a couple of degrees, you're going to have a different tasting product.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen that, I love all brewers, but I've met a number of small brewers that are just like, all they focus on is the recipe, like what variety of hops are we putting in there? What this, that, and absolutely, recipe is important. It's obviously important to a beer, what types and amounts of different malts you put in, hops, but just as important is how you execute that recipe. Are your temperatures consistent? So, I just have stories where I come in, like people be like, oh, what hops are we putting in? I'm like, okay, what's the temperature of that beer? And they're like, oh, we don't know. I'm like, well, that's just as important to the final flavor of the beer than the hops were put that, And so like a lot of people, George and I at AB, a company like that, you really get exposed to that. I have a certain exposure you see in a brewery like that, you just don't see so much in a smaller brewery. It's just a very different focus. But it is very important. Process is hugely important.
So Phil, kind of off the back of the last question on consistency, is a question from Al Segaresi that I'm going to expand upon just a little bit. So I used to live way back in Switzerland. Best thing about Switzerland is there's imports from all the surrounding countries. And I fell head over heels for Belgian beers. And what I started to notice is your average beer is about 4 to 5% with a single grain. Then you've got the doubles, about 8%, the triples, about 10 to 11, and then the quads, which were just off the charts. I remember drinking one because it was named after me. It was 16%. The rest of the day was a blur. But how do you maintain consistency and alcohol content across you've had a great career in various brewing situations, but I think of a Busch Light and it's about 4%, 2%. I think of a Guinness, it's about 4.8. How do you maintain that in terms of process?
I mean, it's somewhat similar, so take, Ommegang is owned by Duvel Marktgat in Belgium, and, the famous golden ale, strong golden ale, Duvel is 8% ABV, I believe. And some of the same things. I mean, that's a very modern brewery, so they have all the flow meters, mass flow meters and everything on all your inputs, and they would blend, incoming malt and hops, blending tanks of beers. It's basically the same ways you're doing to create consistency, blending and process control. It can be a bit of a challenge because of higher ABVs, but it just used very fresh, healthy yeast, frequent propagations. When you're fermenting a beer, like even at Ommegang, I found after 5 or 6 generations of yeast fermentations, at 6 to 10% alcohol, the yeast was I could see changes in fermentation, the velocity and so forth like that. So I'd bring in a fresh culture and propagate a fresh culture. Some breweries will propagate a new culture for every fermentation. So they're always pitching freshly propagated yeast, or they just go through like a couple generations and then bring in a freshly cultured yeast strain. So really it's pretty much a lot of blending, attention to the process, making sure your yeast is healthy, viable, vital.
So you've brought up process as well. So Michael Venturados has a question about kind of sustainability within beer production, Oktoberfest production. I'm going to open the floor to him to ask.
Okay.
He's got multiple questions that he can kind of build upon.
Hi. Am I allowed to speak?
Yep. Floor is all yours.
So, I'm in a class. Oh, first of all, thank you guys for doing this. This has actually been really educational. But yeah, so I'm in a class and we're doing a project and we're focusing on brewery wastes. And so I have questions about the process, about the amount of energy that's used. That's one of my questions. What part of the process uses the most energy and what part uses the least?
Well, I'm not a energy use expert, but the highest energy user is the brew house, I believe, and heating, mashing, steam for a brew kettle and so forth. Possibly maybe, George, like in packaging, like pasteurizers, running those pasteurizers have to be pretty energy.
Yep.
Use a lot of energy.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of work in that realm in the last few decades, I would say. A lot of new brew house designs coming out of the firms in Germany. A lot of it is focused on energy recovery, like off of a kettle stack, recovering that steam, recondensing it and using it to preheat wort, things like that. Certainly, like at Anheuser-Busch, we recovered the CO2, carbon dioxide, off the fermentations and scrubbed that up and reliquefied that for other uses in the brewery. Some smaller breweries, the equipment to do that is fairly cost intensive. So for very small breweries, it's too cost prohibitive to do some of that stuff because of technology. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the outputs of a brewery, spent grain, like our spent grain, we sold to a company that would then sell to dairy farmers. Great food, feed additive for dairy cows and so forth, things like that. So, like I say, I'm no expert in that realm, but there a lot of the innovation, I'd say, in the last 2 or 3 decades in brewery design, amongst other things, has also been geared at sustainability. How do we make our process more sustainable and so forth?
Oh, okay. Wait, can I ask my other questions, or is that too time to?
You have to go back to the line. No, it's okay.
Oh, okay. So, I was wondering if you knew how much it cost to like package beers.
It all depends, what bottle.
Uh-huh.
It's not just a general cost. What kind of bottle you're using, the complexity of your line, your packaging, the label. Do you have a label on it? These are all variables that go into how much it costs to package beer and so forth.
Oh, okay.
It's not just a general number for that or anything.
Understandable. And my last question was about like things like wastewater and then also like spent grain.
Yeah.
My group's studying microbial fuel cells and bioplastics, and so we are wondering, have you ever thought about implementing these things into breweries?
Yeah, I know some breweries will take like spent grains and dry them and then use them as fuel for the boilers. I've heard of that kind of technology. I'm not really familiar with the technology you're talking about, but there has been some work in other areas.
Okay, thank you. That was all.
All right, thanks.
So just one final question. We're going to try and wrap things up in the next couple of minutes, and then we're going to have, in true Chemist Club fashion, just the ability to hang out, catch up with people, catch up with friends. But Carol Hollingsworth from NYU asked a really great question that, again, I kind of want to expand upon is, so how do you develop new products? And specifically with Oktoberfest beers, how do you feel the direction is going to go? Will it move back towards Martins? Will it keep going lighter? In terms of beer product in general, what does that kind of look like? And then what are your thoughts specifically with Oktoberfest in mind?
It seems like what you'd be able to get at the real Oktoberfest is what it is now. It's a traditional, and Americans, they're traditional styles, so I don't see a lot of innovation there because they're very traditional styles and they're best the way that is. I don't know if you're asking beer in general. I don't know. George can tell you a lot, but a lot of these days, what people are drinking is seltzers. These, it's crazy how, it's Truly is done really well, White Claw and so forth. It's alcoholic, it's clear, tastes fruity, so that's really has seen the biggest growth by far in the last few years in our industry.
But that's more from an economical standpoint, but from a beer purist standpoint, that's a complete and utter segue. And
yeah.
The beer purist in me is not a big fan of IPAs because kind of one thing that shocked me with whenever I did the Anheuser-Busch tour was how long do you brew beer for? So I think a Pilsner was like 6 weeks. Was it?
Maybe.
I just about remember that. It was either six weeks or so, but then
Yeah.
IPAs that are coming out, you brew for an afternoon and then you hop the living daylights out of it and hope it's
Well, I mean, don't forget, their IPAs are all ales, so they're typically fermented warmer. So just generally, those processes are quicker because a lager is a cooler, slower fermentation. Ales are typically warmer, a little bit quicker fermentations. Yeah, and then especially some of these very heavily hopped IPAs, what you're smelling and tasting most is the hops. So they mask a lot of underlying things because there's just so much hops in there. But I mean, IPA, strictly speaking, is a very traditional, you talk about pale ales made in Burton-on-Trent, Bass Pale Ale, you're going back into the 1700s. Mm. They just have evolved to what we have now. Now you have hazy IPAs and all these different styles. So yeah, I'm more of a purist in a sense. I just like a really well-balanced, well-executed beer. I don't necessarily need to have a beer that tastes like a pina colada. I want a beer that tastes like a beer. That's my personal thing, but everybody's different.
Hey, this is Roland. I got a little bit of a different question that came up with sustainability. And that is, since Phil and George have both spent their entire career in the beer business, I'm going to call it, do you see a new opportunity in recycling an old concept on refillable bottles? In other words, there was once a time where people brought their bottles back and you refilled them and ran through bottle washers and refilled them, which I guess died, long before we were all born, but they were still there. So is the day of a bottle washer in a regional area on a beer still possible? But maybe you should explain it to everybody because probably nobody knows what I'm talking about except the three of us.
I don't know. I think a lot of that just came down to the economics of operating a bottle washer and all its attendant challenges. Getting those bottles.
Can you explain to everybody what I'm talking about? Because I don't think they know what I'm talking about.
Well, yeah. I mean, and it's still like in Germany, like all of the, at least when last time I was there's no such thing as like one-way bottles. They were all, the half-liter bottles came in a crate, and they would all eventually go back to the brewery and be washed there and reused. But yeah, you're just talking about non-deposit bottles where bottles are returned, empty bottles are collected from the bars or wherever, and then come back to the brewery eventually and then get washed. And a big bottle washer, bottle soaker that would remove the label, clean the interior of the bottle, and then be refilled. Those bottles for that process were heavier bottles, thicker glass, and so forth, so they could withstand the multiple cycles of doing that. But I think it just, the economics, I guess, got prohibitive, especially now, like with the technology, they can make these one-way bottles that are still rigid enough, but the glass is thinner walled, so you're not using as much glass and so forth. So I think the only real impetus to go back to that would be like the economics of it, But I just don't see that as being there right now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you both so much, Phil, George. If you have any final comments, now's the time. But if not, I think it's time to almost wrap up the more formal portion of tonight. Thanks again so much for your insights. I've definitely learned a lot.
It was a lot of fun.
It was a lot of fun. It really was. It's nice to just chat beer with people who know how to make it. As a long-time drinker, first time actually meeting someone who makes it in all my days. Thank you for your insights.
Yeah, no problem. My pleasure.
Pleasure for me also. I just want to say that to me, you know, beer and sharing what I do makes it especially fun because our everyday lives, you know, there's some seriousness to what we do also, you know, but it's really nice to step back and say, you know what, I make beer for a living and it's pretty darn good.
Right.
And I tell you also that I sat yesterday tasting the 4 beers, getting ready for today to see what the differences were and so on and so forth. And may I recommend to you that you have an Oktoberfest, and hopefully you'll have mine, together with some pumpkin pie. It goes really well together.
I
So
can see that.
I want to thank the Chemist Club for giving us this opportunity to talk to you. And especially I want to thank Phil for stepping up to the plate and talking to us. You know, it was really insightful. Thank you, Phil.
No problem, George. I appreciate it. Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, George. Everyone, safe travels and stay safe, stay healthy.
All right.
If anyone's any questions, please get back to me. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks,
care. George.
I'll talk to you soon, George.
Well, everybody. Thank you.
Take care. Nice job.
Thanks.
Good job, everybody.